At 0430 on the morning of July 7th, 1944, Captain Ben Salomon was performing surgery on a wounded soldier in a tent on Saipan. The operating table was a wooden door balanced on ammunition crates. The surgical instruments had been boiled in a helmet filled with water. A kerosene lantern provided the only light. The patient had a shrapnel wound in his abdomen. Salomon's hands moved with precision, removing metal fragments, suturing torn tissue, fighting to save a life in conditions that would have horrified any civilian surgeon. Salomon was 30 years old. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed 175 pounds. He had brown eyes and dark hair that was already showing streaks of gray from the stress of combat surgery. He came from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the son of Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution in Eastern Europe. His father had worked as a tailor, coming home each night with thread on his clothes and calluses on his fingers. His mother had kept the household together through the Depression, stretching every dollar, making sure her children had opportunities she never had. The Salomon family lived in a modest house on the north side of Milwaukee. Ben was the oldest of 3 children. He showed academic promise from an early age. While other boys played baseball in the streets, Ben read books. While other teenagers worried about dances and cars, Ben studied. His parents scraped together money for his education because they believed in the American dream. They believed that in this country, a tailor's son could become anything. Ben Salomon became a dentist. He graduated from the University of Southern California School of Dentistry in 1937. He opened a practice in Los Angeles. He was good at his job. Patients liked him. He had a gentle manner, a steady hand, and a way of putting nervous people at ease. He joined the Army Reserve in 1940 because war was coming, and he wanted to serve. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Salomon was called to active duty. The Army needed dentists. They assigned him to the 102nd Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. He expected to spend the war fixing teeth. He expected to stay behind the lines, far from combat. He expected to return home when it was over and resume his practice. The Army had other plans. The Battle of Saipan began on June 15th, 1944. The island was 1,500 miles from Tokyo. American planners wanted it for airfields. 29 bombers flying from Saipan could reach the Japanese home islands. The Japanese understood this. They had fortified Saipan with 30,000 troops and orders to fight to the death. The 27th Infantry Division landed on Saipan on June 16th. They were National Guard soldiers, mostly from New York. Many had never seen combat. They were about to experience some of the most brutal fighting of the Pacific War. The Japanese did not defend the beaches. They let the Americans come ashore, then counterattacked from prepared positions in the hills and caves. Every yard of ground was contested. Every night brought infiltration attacks. Every day brought more casualties. By July 6th, the Americans had pushed the Japanese into the northern tip of the island. The surviving Japanese forces were cornered, running low on ammunition, running low on food. Their commander, General Yoshitsugu Saito, knew the end was near. He gathered his officers and delivered his final order. There would be no surrender. There would be a gyokosai, a final attack. Every soldier capable of walking would charge the American lines at dawn. They would kill as many Americans as possible before dying. They would die with honor. General Saito then committed ritual suicide. So did Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the commander who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and was now trapped on Saipan. The Japanese military leadership died. The attack order remained. On the night of July 6th, approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers gathered in the darkness north of the American lines. They included walking wounded, clerks, cooks, and sailors who had never held a rifle. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: rifles, bayonets, swords, sharpened bamboo sticks. Some had no weapons at all. They planned to take them from dead Americans. The American front lines that night were held by elements of the 105th Infantry Regiment and the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry. Behind them, a few hundred yards to the rear, was an aid station where Captain Ben Salomon was operating on wounded soldiers. The aid station held approximately 30 wounded men. They lay on stretchers and blankets, waiting for evacuation. Some had minor wounds, others were critical. A handful of medics and surgeons worked through the night, doing what they could with limited supplies. Salomon had been operating for 14 hours straight. His hands were steady despite the exhaustion. His concentration never wavered. The patient on his table was stabilizing. In an hour, maybe two, he could be evacuated to a hospital ship offshore. At 0445, Salomon heard the first shots. If you want to see what Captain Salomon did when 4,000 Japanese soldiers charged his aid station, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Salomon. The Japanese attack hit the American lines like a tidal wave. 4,000 soldiers charging out of the darkness, screaming, firing, stabbing with bayonets. The frontline companies were overwhelmed within minutes. Soldiers who had been sleeping in foxholes woke to find Japanese soldiers on top of them. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry took the brunt of the assault. They fought back with everything they had. Machine guns cut down waves of attackers. Riflemen fired until their barrels glowed red. Artillery called in fire on their own positions, killing Japanese and Americans alike in a desperate attempt to stop the breakthrough. It was not enough. The Japanese pushed through the American lines and kept going. They were not trying to hold ground, they were trying to kill. The Gyokusai was not a military operation in any conventional sense. It was a death ritual. The attackers expected to die. They intended to take as many Americans with them as possible. The frontline battalions disintegrated. Survivors fell back in disorder. Some units lost 90% of their strength in the first 30 minutes. Company commanders died leading counterattacks. Platoon sergeants died, defending wounded comrades. Private soldiers died in hand-to-hand combat with enemies who would not stop coming. The wave swept toward the rear areas. Captain Salomon heard the gunfire growing closer. He looked up from his patient. The tent walls rippled in a sudden breeze. Outside, he could hear running footsteps, shouting, the crack of rifles. A medic burst through the tent flap. They're through the lines. They're coming. Salomon processed the information in seconds. The aid station was 400 yards behind the front lines. If the Japanese had broken through, they would be here in minutes. The aid station held 30 wounded men who could not walk. They had no defensive positions, no machine guns, no way to evacuate. Salomon had a choice. He could try to flee. Some of the medical staff might escape if they ran now. Or he could stay. Stay with the wounded. Stay and fight. He stayed. Salomon ordered the medical staff to evacuate the walking wounded. Those who could move should head south, toward the beach, toward the Navy ships offshore. Those who could not move would stay. Salomon would stay with them. The first Japanese soldier appeared at the tent entrance 4 minutes later. Salomon had found a rifle, an M1 Garand, that belonged to a wounded soldier, too weak to hold it. He was standing near the operating table, the rifle in his hands. He had not fired a weapon in anger since basic training years ago. The Japanese soldier saw the tent filled with wounded Americans. He saw the doctor standing with a rifle. He raised his own weapon. Salomon shot him. The soldier fell in the tent entrance. Behind him, Salomon could see more soldiers running through the aid station. They were killing everyone they found. A wounded man on a stretcher was bayoneted. A medic who raised his hands in surrender was shot through the face. Salomon understood. There would be no prisoners. There would be no mercy. The Japanese were here to kill. He stepped over the body in the entrance and started shooting. The aid station consisted of 4 tents arranged in a rough square. Wounded soldiers lay scattered across the ground. Japanese attackers were moving between the tents, methodically killing the helpless Americans. Salomon moved through the chaos, firing at every Japanese soldier he saw. He was a dentist. He had spent the war filling cavities and extracting teeth. He had almost no combat training. None of that mattered. His first shot hit a soldier who was about to bayonet a wounded man. The soldier spun and fell. Salomon shifted his aim and shot another soldier 10 yards away. Then, another. The M1 Garand held 8 rounds. He fired all 8 in less than 20 seconds. He bent to pick up a rifle from a dead Japanese soldier and kept shooting. Salomon was not operating on instinct. He was operating on something deeper. The wounded men in this aid station were his patients. He was responsible for them. He had sworn an oath to do no harm, and now he was killing to protect those in his care. The distinction mattered to him. It mattered in ways he would never have time to explain. The Japanese soldiers realized someone was fighting back. The easy killing stopped. Soldiers began focusing on the American officer moving through the tents with a rifle. They had expected to find only wounded men and terrified medics. They had found something else. A Japanese sergeant organized a group of 5 soldiers to eliminate Salomon. They approached the operating tent from 2 directions, intending to catch him in a crossfire. Salomon saw them coming. He ducked behind the operating table, the same table where he had been saving a life 10 minutes earlier. He heard footsteps on both sides of the tent. 2 soldiers entered from the left. Salomon shot them both. He rolled to his right as bullets punched through the canvas where he had been standing. 2 more soldiers came through the right entrance. Salomon shot one, clubbed the other with his rifle butt. The 5th soldier, the sergeant, threw a grenade into the tent. Salomon grabbed the grenade and threw it back out. It exploded in the air, 10 feet from the sergeant. Shrapnel tore through the man's chest. Salomon was bleeding. A bullet had grazed his left arm during the exchange. He did not stop to treat the wound. There was no time. Outside the tent, the battle had become a nightmare. Japanese soldiers were everywhere. American wounded were crawling, dragging themselves away from attackers they could not fight. The few medics who had not evacuated were being killed. Salomon emerged from the operating tent with a rifle in each hand. He had picked up a second weapon from one of the dead Japanese soldiers. He fired both guns alternately, one shot, then the other, moving toward the heaviest concentration of enemy soldiers. He found them near the south side of the aid station. A group of approximately 20 Japanese soldiers had gathered around a captured American machine gun. They were trying to turn it toward the fleeing Americans. If they succeeded, they could massacre the survivors as they ran. Salomon attacked them. He did not wait for support. He did not take cover. He charged straight at 20 enemy soldiers, firing as he ran. The Japanese saw him coming. They turned to face the threat. Some raised their rifles. Others reached for bayonets. Salomon shot 5 of them before he reached the position. He clubbed 2 more with his rifle when the magazine ran empty. He drew a knife, a surgical scalpel he had tucked into his belt, and stabbed a soldier who grappled with him. The fight lasted 45 seconds. When it ended, 10 Japanese soldiers were dead and the rest had scattered. Salomon had been bayoneted in the left shoulder. He had been shot in the right leg. He was still standing. He pulled himself to the machine gun. It was a .30 caliber M1919, mounted on a tripod. The Japanese had not figured out how to operate it. The bolt was still locked back, ready to fire. Salomon settled behind the gun. His left arm was nearly useless. Blood ran down his right leg. He wrapped his good hand around the grip and aimed at the Japanese soldiers regrouping 50 yards away. He pulled the trigger. The M1919 fired 500 rounds per minute. The belt held 250 rounds. Salomon emptied the entire belt into the Japanese formation. Bodies dropped across the hillside. Soldiers who had been advancing turned and ran. The machine gun's roar echoed across the battlefield, drowning out the screams and the explosions. Salomon reloaded. He found ammunition boxes stacked near the position. The Japanese had captured the gun, but had not thought to destroy the ammunition. He fed a fresh belt into the receiver, charged the bolt, and started firing again. The Japanese commander realized that the aid station had become a defensive position. One man with a machine gun was blocking the southern approach. The attack had to continue. There were thousands of Americans to the south who could still be killed. He ordered a company to eliminate the machine gunner. 30 soldiers advanced toward Salomon's position. They moved in a spread formation, trying to present difficult targets. They fired as they advanced, peppering the area around the machine gun with rifle rounds. Salomon tracked them with the M1919. He fired in short bursts, conserving ammunition. The first burst hit 3 soldiers. The second burst hit 2 more. The advancing line wavered. They kept coming. They had been ordered to die. One machine gun would not stop them. Salomon fired until the belt ran dry. He reloaded while bullets cracked over his head. A round hit the machine gun's receiver. The mechanism jammed. The gun fell silent. 20 Japanese soldiers were still coming. Salomon picked up his rifle. He had perhaps 16 rounds left, 2 clips that he had scavenged during the fighting. He aimed carefully and fired. 1 shot, 1 kill. Another shot, another kill. The advancing soldiers began to fall. He emptied the first clip, reloaded, kept firing. The Japanese reached his position when he had 3 rounds left. The first soldier came over the sandbag wall with a bayonet extended. Salomon shot him at point-blank range. The second soldier tackled him from the side. Salomon twisted free, shot him in the chest. 1 round left. A third soldier raised a sword. Salomon shot him through the throat. The rifle pinged empty. More soldiers were climbing over the wall. Salomon reversed his grip on the rifle and swung it like a club. The walnut stock connected with a soldier's skull. The man dropped. Salomon swung again, hitting another soldier in the chest. The stock shattered. Salomon was left holding a piece of wood and twisted metal. He picked up a bayonet from the ground and kept fighting. The hand-to-hand combat lasted 3 minutes. Salomon stabbed, slashed, and grappled with soldiers who came at him from every direction. He was wounded again and again. A bayonet thrust to his abdomen. A sword cut across his back. A bullet through his left shoulder, shattering the bone. He did not stop. A Japanese officer appeared before him, sword raised for a killing blow. Salomon drove the bayonet into the man's chest with his remaining strength. The officer fell. The sword dropped from his hands. Salomon picked up the sword and turned to face the next attacker. There was no next attacker. The soldiers around him were dead or dying. The assault on his position had failed. Salomon staggered back to the machine gun. The jammed mechanism needed to be cleared. He worked the bolt with his one functioning arm, feeling for the obstruction. His fingers found a bent cartridge case wedged in the chamber. He pried it loose, fed in a fresh belt, and charged the weapon. The gun fired. More Japanese soldiers were approaching from the north. Salomon swung the machine gun on its tripod and opened fire. The attackers went to ground. Some tried to advance by crawling. Salomon lowered his aim and cut them down. The sun was rising over Saipan. The battle had been raging for nearly an hour. Captain Ben Salomon had been fighting for 45 minutes. He had been wounded 7 times. He had killed more Japanese soldiers than most rifle companies, and they were still coming. The Gyokusai had committed 4,000 soldiers to the attack. The front lines had killed many. Artillery had killed many more. But thousands remained, pushing south, looking for Americans to kill. They found the aid station. A second wave approached Salomon's position. This time, they came from 3 directions at once. 50 soldiers, maybe more, converging on the single machine gun that was blocking their advance. Salomon traversed the gun left and fired a long burst. He traversed right and fired another burst. He traversed center and emptied the remaining ammunition into the densest concentration of attackers. The belt ran dry. He reached for another ammunition box. His hand closed on empty air. He had used all the ammunition near the position. Japanese soldiers were 20 yards away, advancing at a run. Salomon stood up from behind the machine gun. He picked up a rifle from a dead American nearby. He checked the magazine. 3 rounds. He shot 3 soldiers. The rifle pinged empty. He picked up another rifle. 5 rounds. He shot 5 more soldiers. He found a Japanese Arisaka rifle. The bolt was stiff, unfamiliar. He worked it anyway, firing at attackers who were now less than 10 yards away. The rifle was empty. There were no more weapons within reach. Salomon drew his surgical scalpel and charged. The last minutes of Captain Ben Salomon's life were witnessed by no one who survived. What happened can only be reconstructed from the evidence found afterward. When American forces recaptured the aid station 3 days later, they found Salomon's body slumped over the machine gun. He had died there, at the gun, still facing the enemy. They counted the Japanese bodies around his position. The count took a long time. 98. 98 dead Japanese soldiers lay in and around the position Captain Ben Salomon had defended. Some had been shot. Some had been bayoneted. Some had been killed with edged weapons. Some had been beaten to death. The investigators counted Salomon's wounds. There were 76 bullet holes in his body. He had been bayoneted multiple times. He had sword cuts on his arms and back. The evidence suggested that Salomon had been wounded early in the engagement, probably in the first 10 minutes. He had continued fighting for at least 30 more minutes after receiving wounds that should have killed him. Medical examiners concluded that he had likely died from blood loss while still firing the machine gun. His hands were still gripping the weapon when they found him. His eyes were still open, still looking north, still watching for the next attack. The wounded soldiers in the aid station had been evacuated during the fighting. Medical staff who fled south reported that they could hear the machine gun firing behind them for nearly an hour. The gun covered their retreat. It drew Japanese attention away from the fleeing wounded. It held the line, while others escaped. 22 wounded soldiers survived because of what Salomon did. 22 men who could not walk, could not fight, could not defend themselves. They lived because a dentist picked up a rifle and decided that his patients would not die. The Battle of Saipan ended on July 9th, 1944. The Gyokusai attack of July 7th had killed more than 4,300 Japanese soldiers. American casualties that day exceeded 800, killed and wounded. It remains the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. The 27th Infantry Division was devastated. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment ceased to exist as effective units. Companies that had landed with 180 men were reduced to fewer than 20. In the aftermath, survivors began telling stories about what had happened at the aid station. Stories about a doctor who fought like a demon. Stories about a machine gun that never stopped firing. Stories about 98 Japanese bodies piled around a single position. The stories seemed impossible. One man could not kill 98 enemy soldiers. One man could not hold off a battalion-sized assault. The numbers had to be exaggerated. Army investigators examined the evidence. They interviewed survivors. They counted the bodies. They analyzed the wounds. The numbers were accurate. Captain Ben Salomon had killed more enemy soldiers in a single engagement than any American medical officer in history. He had done so while performing his primary duty, protecting wounded soldiers who could not protect themselves. He had died at his post, still fighting, still defending. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was submitted in August 1944. It was denied. The Geneva Convention prohibited medical personnel from engaging in combat. Doctors, medics, and chaplains were protected under international law, but only if they did not take up arms. Salomon had taken up arms. He had killed nearly 100 enemy soldiers. By the strict interpretation of military regulations, he had forfeited his protected status. The Army awarded him a Distinguished Service Cross instead. It was the second highest medal for valor, appropriate for actions that did not quite meet the Medal of Honor criteria. Some officers objected. They argued that Salomon's situation was unique. He had not attacked the enemy. The enemy had attacked his aid station. He had defended wounded soldiers who were being murdered. The Geneva Convention protected medical facilities, but the Japanese had not respected that protection. The objections went nowhere. Regulations were regulations. Ben Salomon's family received his Distinguished Service Cross in 1945. His parents accepted the medal without knowing the full story of what their son had done. They knew he had died in combat. They knew he had been brave. They did not know about the 98 bodies, or the 76 wounds, or the machine gun that fired until the ammunition ran out. The full story emerged slowly, over decades. In 1969, a group of veterans from the 27th Infantry Division began lobbying to upgrade Salomon's award to the Medal of Honor. They had been there. They had seen the aftermath. They knew what the record did not reflect. The Army reviewed the case and denied the upgrade. The same Geneva Convention objections applied. In 1988, another review, another denial. In 1998, Representative Robert Dornan of California introduced legislation to have Salomon's case reconsidered. The legislation failed. The veterans kept trying. Men who had been privates and sergeants in 1944 were now in their 72nds and 82nds. They wrote letters. They contacted congressmen. They told the story to anyone who would listen. A dentist. 98 Japanese soldiers. 76 wounds. Died at the machine gun with his hands still on the grip. In 2002, the Secretary of the Army announced a new review of Salomon's case. The review would consider whether the Geneva Convention objections were appropriately applied. The review board examined the original records. They consulted with legal experts. They analyzed the circumstances of Salomon's actions. Their conclusion: Ben Salomon had not violated the Geneva Convention. He had defended a medical facility against an attack that targeted wounded patients. The Japanese had forfeited any claim to the convention's protection by attacking a clearly marked aid station. Salomon's actions were legally and morally justified. On May 1st, 2002, the President of the United States announced that Captain Ben Salomon would receive the Medal of Honor posthumously. The ceremony was held at the White House on May 1st, 2002. Dr. Robert West, a friend and fellow dentist who had advocated for the award for decades, accepted the medal on behalf of the Salomon family. Ben Salomon's parents had died years earlier. His siblings had passed. There was no direct family left to receive the honor. Dr. West stood in the Rose Garden, the Medal of Honor in his hands. 58 years had passed since Ben Salomon died on Saipan. 58 years since he killed 98 Japanese soldiers to protect 22 wounded Americans. 58 years since he demonstrated that a man's profession does not determine his capacity for courage. The citation described his actions in formal military language: extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty, conspicuous gallantry at the risk of his life, single-handedly engaged the enemy in close combat. What the citation could not capture was the man himself. Ben Salomon had been a healer. He had spent his life fixing teeth, easing pain, treating the small everyday complaints of his patients. He had gentle hands. He had a kind manner. He had chosen a profession dedicated to helping people. On the morning of July 7th, 1944, he became a killer. Not because he wanted to kill, but because killing was the only way to save the men in his care. He picked up a rifle because the alternative was watching his patients be murdered. The transformation was instant and complete. A man who had never fired a weapon in combat became one of the deadliest soldiers of the Pacific War. A man who had sworn to do no harm did extraordinary harm to the enemy. And then he died, still fighting, still protecting, still refusing to abandon his post. The moral calculus of what Salomon did remains complex. He was a medical officer who killed 98 men. He violated the non-combatant status that protected doctors and medics. He crossed a line that military regulations and international law said should not be crossed. But he saved lives. 22 wounded soldiers survived because Ben Salomon held the line. 22 men who could not walk, who could not fight, who would have been bayoneted in their stretchers if not for one dentist with a machine gun. They went home. They had families. They lived decades of life that would not have existed without Salomon's sacrifice. How do you weigh 98 enemy deaths against 22 American lives saved? How do you balance the violation of medical neutrality against the protection of helpless patients? These questions have no easy answers. Ben Salomon answered them with action. He made his choice in the moment, without time for ethical deliberation, without opportunity for second guessing. He chose to fight. He chose to kill. He chose to die at his post rather than abandon the men who depended on him. The Medal of Honor that finally came to him in 2002 was appropriate recognition for extraordinary valor, but it was also something more. It was an acknowledgement that rules and regulations, however important, cannot anticipate every situation. It was an admission that a man who violates the letter of the law may still exemplify its spirit. Ben Salomon broke the rules. He also saved lives. Both things are true. Both things matter. After the Medal of Honor ceremony, there were efforts to preserve Salomon's memory. The American Dental Association established an award in his name for military dentists who demonstrate exceptional courage. The Army Dental Corps dedicated a clinic to him at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. In Milwaukee, where Salomon grew up, a marker was placed near the neighborhood where he spent his childhood. The marker describes his service and his sacrifice. It does not try to explain what happened at Saipan. Some things cannot be explained to those who are not there. The veterans who fought to obtain Salomon's Medal of Honor mostly died before 2002. They did not live to see the recognition they had sought for so long, but they had passed the story to a new generation. Researchers, historians, and journalists picked up where the veterans left off. Books were written. Documentaries were filmed. The story of the dentist who killed 98 Japanese soldiers became known beyond the small circle of Pacific War veterans who had always remembered it. The story still surprises people who hear it for the first time. A dentist? 98 soldiers? It sounds impossible. It sounds like Hollywood fiction. But it happened. On Saipan, in the pre-dawn darkness of July 7th, 1944, a man discovered that he was capable of things he had never imagined. He discovered that the skills he had developed for healing could also be used for killing. He discovered that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Ben Salomon was afraid that morning. He had to have been afraid. 4,000 Japanese soldiers were charging through the darkness. His friends were dying. His patients were about to be murdered. Any rational person would have been terrified. He fought anyway. He fought when his rifle was empty. He fought when his machine gun jammed. He fought with bayonets and swords in his bare hands. He fought until there was no more ammunition, no more weapons, no more strength left in his body. He fought until he died. That is what the Medal of Honor represents. Not just skill or effectiveness in combat, though Salomon demonstrated both. It represents the willingness to give everything, to sacrifice absolutely for the protection of others. Ben Salomon gave everything. He saved 22 lives with his death. He proved that a man's profession does not limit his capacity for heroism. The patients he saved that morning never forgot him. The ones who survived the war told their children about the doctor who stood between them and death. They spoke his name with reverence. He was their savior. He was their protector. He was the man who did what had to be done, regardless of the cost. And in the end, the cost was everything. Ben Salomon was buried on Saipan, in one of the temporary cemeteries that dotted the island after the battle. His body was later moved to the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii. He lies there today, among thousands of other service members who died in the Pacific War. His grave is marked with a simple white headstone. The headstone does not mention the Medal of Honor that took 58 years to receive. It does not mention the 98 enemy soldiers he killed. It says only what matters. Captain, Dental Corps, the 7th of July, 1944. Visitors to the cemetery sometimes pause at his grave. Some know the story, others discover it later, looking up the name, learning about the dentist who became a warrior. The story moves them. It moves them because it speaks to something deep in human nature, the desire to protect, the willingness to sacrifice, the capacity for ordinary people to do extraordinary things when the moment demands it. Ben Salomon was an ordinary man. He was a dentist from Milwaukee who joined the army because there was a war. and he wanted to help. He expected to fill cavities. He ended up filling graves. The war made him a hero. It also made him a killer. It forced him to discover parts of himself that he might have preferred not to know existed. That is what war does. It reveals. It exposes the truth of who we are when everything is stripped away. Some men discover they are cowards. Some discover they are heroes. Most discover they are somewhere in between. Ben Salomon discovered that he was willing to die for his patients. He discovered that he could kill without hesitation when their lives depended on it. He discovered that the oath he had sworn as a doctor, to do no harm, could be fulfilled in the most unexpected ways. He did no harm to his patients. He did tremendous harm to those who tried to kill them. The distinction mattered. In the years since his death, the military medical community has grappled with the questions his story raises. When can medical personnel take up arms? What are the limits of the non-combatant protection? How do you balance the Geneva Convention with the realities of combat? There are no definitive answers. Each situation is different. Each decision must be made in the moment, without time for careful deliberation. Ben Salomon made his decision. He decided that the lives in his care were more important than regulations, more important than his protected status, more important than his own survival. He was right. The 22 soldiers who survived because of his actions would tell you he was right. Their children and grandchildren would tell you he was right. The generations that exist because Ben Salomon held the line on July 7th, 1944, would tell you he was right. 98 dead Japanese soldiers would tell you something else, if they could speak. But they attacked a medical facility. They tried to murder wounded men. They forfeited any claim to sympathy when they violated the most basic laws of war. Ben Salomon did not start the killing. He finished it. That is his legacy. Not the Medal of Honor, though he earned it. Not the 98 confirmed kills, though the number is staggering. His legacy is the 22 lives saved. His legacy is the demonstration that courage has no profession, that heroism can emerge from the most unexpected places. A dentist from Milwaukee, a man who had barely fired a rifle before Saipan, a healer who became a warrior when there was no other choice. Ben Salomon. Remember the name. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single week. Stories about dentists and doctors who pick up rifles when their patients are in danger. Real people, real heroism, real sacrifice. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States? From Israel? From Canada? From Australia? From Germany? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you work in medicine and what this story means to you. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Ben Salomon does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen. 58 years is too long to wait for recognition. But the recognition came. The story is being told. The memory survives. A dentist. 98 soldiers. 22 lives saved. That is the story. That is the legacy. That is Ben Salomon.